Job chapter number 24 and verse number 17, Job was getting a response from God. In verse number 17, the Lord said to Job, "For the morning is to them even as the shadow of death. If one know them," watch what your Bible says, "they are in the terrors of the shadow of death." Let's bow. I want to draw your attention this morning to the word in verse number 17 where the Lord told Job, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. Now, let me say the word terrors in this passage of Scripture means the destruction of. It means to be alarmed. Matter of fact, the word terror is very familiar in our day and in our society. September the 11th helped us understand what terror is and helps us understand what terrors are. It strikes fear and it strikes woe in the hearts of all mankind. And the Lord told Job there are terrors of the shadow of death. Let me say that Job is the oldest book in the King James Bible, chronologically speaking. You say, well, I thought Genesis was. No, Genesis is the first book of the Bible, but Job was written nearly 6,000 years ago. Job is the oldest book in your Bible. And there was something that happened in Job's day that was terrorizing men that still terrorizes men in this day. You say, preacher, what is it? It is simply the shadow of death. It terrorized men back then, and it still terrorizes men today. Now let me give you a definition of the word shadow. A shadow points to a solid object. A shadow follows after an object. This morning, the object is death himself. The Bible said in Psalms 24, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." In other words, there is a shadow that is cast from a man by the name of death in your Word of God. Now, I begin to study this phrase, the shadow of death, and I come to find out that it is mentioned over 19 times in your King James Bible. Matter of fact, if you were to ask anybody about the shadow of death, I believe Job could tell you more about it than any other man. Because just 9 times alone in the book of Job, you'll find the phrase, the shadow of death. What is the shadow of death? Why in the world did God have it mentioned over 19 times in the Bible? Why in the world do we hear about the shadow of death? Why does death have a shadow? What is its purpose? Why is it here? I want to preach with God's help this morning on this title, Living Under the Shadow of Death. I believe that we are living under the shadow of death. Matter of fact, at the point of birth, you begin to die. Am I not right? Yeah. When you're young, you are beginning to decay. When you are born to this world, death is already after you. We live in a day-by-day shadow of death. And sometimes that shadow will overwhelm us. Sometimes that shadow will even overtake us. Now let me give you this little thought real quickly, which will help me get into the message. If you look at a shadow, not any, just a shadow outside or at night, when you look at a shadow, it describes the object. It tells you a little bit about what you're seeing a shadow of. And let me just give you a few things by looking at the shadow of death, what it describes about death. Let me say real quickly that when we see a shadow, or when a shadow is cast, it is simply an interference of light. That's what makes a shadow. When you see a shadow cast on the wall or a shadow cast on the floor, it's because it is interfering with the light. So let me say number one, when I look at the shadow of death, it tells me that death is very dreary. Death is very dark. When a shadow is cast, it is cast because of an interference with light. When a shadow comes, it brings darkness, and when a shadow comes, it brings gloom. When you look at a shadow, you don't think it's beautiful and you don't think it's pretty to look at. A shadow is just a shadow. Let me say this, there's nothing pretty about the funeral home. I don't care if it's a saved person. I don't care if it's a lost person. I don't care if they lived a good life or they lived a wicked life. When you go to the funeral home, it's a time for weeping. It's a time for mourning. It's a time for sadness and sorrow. And that's exactly what death brings. It brings its sorrow. It brings its darkness. It brings its sadness. That's what death is. It's very dreary. We can see this through the shadow of death. Let me say, there's nothing pretty about the hospital. I went to the hospital just last night, and there's nothing pretty about it at all. There's people there on the brink of life or death. There's people there not knowing about tomorrow. There's people there without answers and without knowledge. I'm telling you, a shadow brings darkness. It brings gloom. And that's what the shadow of death is. It brings the darkness and gloom of death itself. There's nothing happy and there's nothing pretty about a deathbed. It still brings weeping, it still brings sadness, and it still brings sorrow. So I find not only by looking at the shadow of death, you'll find death's dreariness, but secondly, write this down, you'll find death's dominion. Now let me give you this quickly. Listen to me. A shadow can appear at any time. It don't matter if it's 12 o'clock at noon. It don't matter if it's 12 o'clock at midnight. A shadow can appear at any time. You know what that tells me death's dominion is? He don't run around with a watch taped to his arm. He don't have a clock in his back pocket. Death can come at any time. Death can come at any moment. He is not bound by time, and he's also not bound by space. Because not only can a shadow appear at any time, but a shadow can appear at any place.
Amen.
I got to thinking about this. I was upstairs in my study, and I began to look around in the room, and there were shadows. I walked outside in my front yard, and there were shadows in the broad daylight. I walked out last night on the back porch, and guess what I found? There were shadows out on the back porch at midnight. There's shadows everywhere. You can find them in your closet. You can find them at the house of God. You can find shadows anywhere. They'll always be there. Same thing about death. Death can come in any place. He can come at any time. There's nothing stopping him. There's nothing holding him back. If death wanted to walk in these four walls this afternoon, if he wanted to walk in the house of God and take somebody, he could. He has that power. He has that ability. He can show up at any time. He can show up at any place. Death has no physical boundaries.
Amen.
Talking about the shadow of death, it speaks of the dreariness. It speaks of the dominion of death. But let me say this, when you think of the shadow, watch this, it speaks of the deception of death. You know what I noticed about a shadow? It's not loud at all. Matter of fact, a shadow has no sound to it. Matter of fact, you can't hear it. A shadow is very quiet. In other words, you'll never sense it coming or you'll never hear it coming. Same way with death. There's no way that you can sense death coming. There's no way that you can hear him coming. Sometimes he comes and it's almost like it's a sudden death. How many's ever went to the funeral home and experienced a tragic accident? I mean, you said, I can't believe they're dead. I can't believe they died. It seems to be as if a tragic accident took place. Death comes uncertainly. There is a deception of death. It comes in unaware. It comes in unknowing. You may have the shadow of death glooming over you today in the service. You don't know what tomorrow holds. You don't know what this next second holds. But I'm glad I do know who holds tomorrow, praise God. I find the deception that death brings. Let me also say this about death and its deception. Did you know that shadows sometimes are there that we can't even see them? Now, I don't know if there's anybody here that's ever done this or not, but you can take night vision goggles and you can walk out into the pitch black darkness where there's no sun, where there's no moon, and there's no stars. And you can take, in those night vision goggles, you can look through, and guess what you'll find? Shadows. There will always be shadows. There are shadows here today, and you know what? You may not see them. You may not be able to tangibly touch it, but it's still there. The deception of death is there. Let me give you this. The shadow of death is the transportation to hell for the lost humanity, as one preacher said. Let me give you this verse in Job chapter number 38 and verse number 17. You don't have to turn there. Job 38:17 says, have the gates of death been open unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? I'm telling you that we are living under the shadow of death. Now you say, preacher, is death a real person? Is death a real being? Is he an actual object? Sure he is. Revelation chapter number 6, verse number 7 through 8. John said, and when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast saying, come and see. And watch verse number 8. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death. And hell followed with him. John said that I saw there was a fourth seal open. And he said, I heard the fourth beast say, come and look. And there was a pale horse. And his name that sat on it was called Death. And the Bible said hell followed him. So yes, death is a real person. He is a living, he is a breathing thing that God uses to bring destruction and to bring destruction and devastation to the lives of many. It's this thing called death. Let me give you a few things this morning about this person called death. Number one, I want you to notice real quickly the mystery of death. You say, preacher, does death really have a mystery? Sure he does. You don't have to turn there. I'm just going to quote them to you real quickly. But when you go to the book of Genesis, chapter number 2, I begin to see the mystery of this man by the name of Death. In Genesis chapter number 2 and verse number 17, God said, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, watch what he said, thou shalt surely die. I'm talking about you can find the death or the shadow of death at the very tree of life. So I find him in the sovereignty of God. God was ready to loose him at the tree of life. He hung around the tree of life. He hung around the Garden of Eden. And when Adam and Eve partook of the fruit, he was able to be loosed. He was able to seek. He was able to devour. Death has always been, and death will always be until Jesus puts a stop to it in the book of Revelation. Death is in his sovereignty. Number two, I find death in the Scriptures. It don't matter where you turn. It don't matter where you go. You'll always find death. Matter of fact, the first time you'll ever find death is in Genesis chapter 4, verse number 8. The Bible said, and Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass that they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. So we find death in the Scriptures, and we also find death in the sovereignty of God. But let me say, we'll find death in the shadows. He's always hid himself in the shadows. You'll never see him in Genesis chapter 2. You'll never see him in Genesis chapter 4. But guess what? He's still there. That's exactly what he's doing until Revelation chapter 6. He's hiding himself in his own shadow. The shadow of death. Amen. Let me give you this real quickly. Not only do we find the mystery of death. Write this down, number 2. I find the method of death. You say, preacher, what is the method of death? Well, he uses what we call disease. He uses diseases. See, back in the 1800s and back in the early 1900s, have you ever heard it? They call it scarlet fever. We came up for a cure. Death came back in and created tuberculosis. We came up with antibiotics. We come up with a cure. He stepped in and brought in typhoid. We come up with a cure. We come up with antibiotics. He brought in polio. After we come up with a cure and we brought up antibiotics, he brought in smallpox. I'm talking about men died with these diseases. And you say, preacher, what do we have today? Leukemia, AIDS. People are dying by the millions by this disease called AIDS. There's no antibiotic. There's no cure for AIDS. Heart disease, lung cancer, strokes, and even heart attacks. That's the day and hour we're living in. And as soon as we come up with a cure, death will step back on the scene and come up with another disease. He has his methods to reach you, and he has his methods to reach me. I sit with a man last night in his home. Me and my pop went to visit him. And he's eat up with cancer. And he said, I'm a dying man. He said, I look pretty good on the outside, but deep down on the inside, he said, I'm a dying away. And I got to thinking about that. That's what death does. It takes you and it completely destroys your life, no matter what means of necessary that it comes. You say, oh, preacher, you know what? I won't die. I'll never face this man by the name of death. I'll never come with a head-on collision with him. You may not. You may not today, but you may tomorrow. There's a man in my home church, and he woke up on Sunday morning just about a year or two ago. On a Sunday morning, getting ready for church. His wife had already got ready. His kids were already ready. And he was getting ready for church himself, heading to Sunday school. And he told his kids, he said, my chest is hurting. He told his wife, he said, my chest is hurting. He said, y'all go on without me. His wife said, I'm going to hang out here with you and take you to the doctor and see what's going on with you, man. How many's ever heard of the doctor, the Kaiser Permanente? Some people may have heard about that hospital, that doctor's office. As his boys went on to church, he drove to the doctor's office and went to see his doctor at the Kaiser building in Atlanta. When he got there, they checked his heart and they said that you've got a major blockage, several blockages in your heart. There's nothing that we can do for you here. We've already called for an ambulance. And they're going to rush you right up here to Southern Regional, one exit down the road. Pop, you know right where it's at. When the ambulance got there, they loaded him in the back and they put the heart monitors on him. They put an IV in his arm. I'm talking about being in the safest place in the world, in the back of an ambulance. Brother Bill, as they left, they got onto the interstate and the ambulance opened up in sirens and they're taking off towards the hospital, one exit up the road. And all of a sudden the machine said that his heart quit beating. All of a sudden the machine said that there's no life. And they had to pull the ambulance over on the side of the road. And they hooked up the electric shocks and they began to shock him. And they began to try to revive him. They tried to do CPR and bring him back to life in the back of an ambulance on the way to the hospital. And he died one exit before he got to the hospital. Even to this day, his wife will still say, would to God we'd have just took you straight to the hospital. You know what? It wouldn't have mattered because you have an appointment with death. And it don't matter where you're at. It don't matter what you're doing. When it's your time to go, it's your time to go.
Amen. Yeah.
He was overtaken by a heart attack. I'm talking about disease takes man. He uses a method of destruction. You say, what is that? We've had World War I, World War II. We're fixing to face World War III. Some of y'all seen the pictures from Vietnam. You've seen them for Korea. And I'm telling you, nation shall rise against nation. He uses war. He uses pestilence to bring upon destruction of all mankind. And even today, nearly some 2,000 of our troops have lost their lives overseas to a man by the name of death. The body bags are still rolling home today because of death. He uses disease. He uses destruction. He also uses devastation. Earthquakes. I've got a missionary friend of mine. He's trying to come by here in August, going to tell us about his burden going to Indonesia. You realize they lost 4,000 people within the first hour? 1 hour, and God allowed 4,000 people to die. Now, all that's over there is Buddhists and Muslims. And I'm going to tell you something. You can't be a Buddhist and get to heaven, and you sure can't be a Muslim and get to heaven. They died and went to hell. 4,000 men, women, boys, and girls. And I just heard the other day they're still finding bodies today. One earthquake. Death said, I need 4,000, and God said, it's yours. On September the 11th, he came to America, and within 1 hour, we lost 2,000 precious Americans in the Twin Towers. Death said, I need 2,000 souls. 2,000. Earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes. Boy, what a season for hurricanes. God just kicked up the dust of His heels, and He sent a little storm over called Katrina, and it wiped out thousands dead. I talked with the preacher, and he said, we went down there to pass out disaster relief, and he said, preacher, you'll never understand it. You'll never understand it. He said, you won't understand the smell that we had to endure when we went down there. I said, what was it? He said, it was the smell of dead bodies. Thousands. Why? Because death uses devastation. He uses tornadoes. He also uses tsunamis. They're still finding bodies today that happened over a year ago when that tsunami hit. 30-foot tall waves crashing into buildings, laid them down like toothpicks. Death told God, I need 4,000. I need 6,000. I need 2,000. I'm talking about dying and spending the rest of their life in eternity. Oh, preacher, it can't happen to me. He'll use destruction. He'll use devastation. He'll also use drunkenness. Now, I'm going to step out on a limb right here. I'm going to tell you something. Alcohol has wrecked the lives of many. Alcohol has wrecked many homes, and alcohol has wrecked many lives. I'm going to tell you something. Every time I see a drunk driver accident, every time I see a young teenager that has crashed his car and almost lost his life, I want to say, where's Budweiser now? Where's the beer companies now? Why don't they put that on their billboards? Why don't they promote what's going on in the real world? I'm simply saying alcohol and drunkenness is killing people. Amen. By the thousands in this country a year. Death has his way to get to you. Oh, preacher, I won't drink. And I sure won't be driving when I do drink. You may not, but somebody across you that's coming your direction may. You may walk out of here today, Brother Bramlett, and I'm not putting you out and trying to set you aside, but you may walk out here today, and there may be a drunk driver out here on 441, cross over that little grass median, and before you have time to turn your little truck around, they crash right to the side of you, and you're snatched out into eternity forever. Death, it comes unknowingly. It's like a shadow. You don't see it coming. You don't hear it coming. He uses drunkenness. Number 3, let me say he uses drugs. Preacher, what's killing the young people today? I tell you what's killing them. It's overdoses. Amen. You realize that you can shoot up over and over and over again and never get sick, but you put the wrong needle in your arm, you'll end up with AIDS and die. I'm telling you, we are plagued with a nation full of drugs and alcohol, and I'm telling you, it's killing our young people. I'm telling you, they are living under the shadow of death. You mess around with drugs, you mess around with alcohol, you mess around with the things of the world and the pleasures of the world, you are living under the shadow of death. Amen. You better listen to this little Georgia preacher this morning. I know what I'm talking about. I walked in the funeral home one morning fixing to get ready to eat my breakfast. And they said, preacher, they said, come back here to the embalming room. Do you know this young lady? She went to your high school. I walked in and laying on the table was a young lady that I went to school with my whole life. And you say, what happened to her? She was 19 years old. Her and her little boyfriend was down there making a drug deal and it went bad. And a little 16-year-old boy pulled out a .22 pistol and shot him in the chest and killed him. And then when she realized she was in enough trouble, she turned her back and she began to run. And I seen where the bullet hole went in the back of her head and it come out of her lip. She died instantly and died and went to hell. Death won't get me. You live under the shadow of death, it will. Amen. Some of you are living under the shadow of death today. Drugs and drunkenness. Let me say something real quickly. Death has got a way to do you in. Hebrews chapter 9, verse number 27, you say, prove it, preacher. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. You got an appointment with death, and this is an appointment that you will not be late for. Death will find you. Let me say, not only do I find the destruction, the drunkenness of the methods of death, but I also find death's moderation. I've got to hurry. Let me say this. Death would kill everybody in this room this morning if he could. Death would wipe me out if he could, because he don't like me exposing him. I'm putting a target on my back by preaching on death. He's alive and he's very well and he's very present. Death has no dominion. Matter of fact, he has no care for your soul. And death would kill everybody if he could. Can I say this about his moderation? You know how a shadow gets its power? Through the sun. Let me say this. Without the sun, there would be no shadow. In other words, without light, there would be no shadow. In other words, death has to get permission from headquarters before he can do anything. Amen. He's got to check with the God of lights. He's got to check with the resurrection and the life before he lays his hand on anybody. He has a moderation. Let me say in closing this morning, death also has its myths. Death's moderation, death's mystery, death's methods. But let me close this morning and say death has its myths. You say, preacher, what is the myth about death? Well, a lot of people say, because I'm saved and because I'm born again, death can't touch me. You're wrong. You can die just like a sinner can. I can step right out here today and have a heart attack just like a sinner can. Death does not care about you, and death does not care about me. So number one, you can't hide behind your faith and say death can't touch me. Number two, you can't hide behind the facts and say death can't touch me. You say, what's the facts? That's after you go to the doctor's appointment and he says your heart looks good and your lungs look A-OK and it seems like there's no blood clots this time around and everything's all right. You can walk right out the doctor's office and death finds you in the parking lot.
Amen.
Death can come at any time. Death does not care about your faith. Death does not care about your facts. And death really don't care about your feelings either. Oh, preacher, you know what? I feel real good this morning. Matter of fact, I worked out all week this week. And I ate right. And I worked out properly. And I've got my daily exercise. And I drank 8 ounces of water. And I drank 8 glasses of water today. Preacher, I'm fine. Death can't find me. Yes, he can. That's a myth you've heard. Death takes the healthy just as he does the weak.
Amen.
My papa was there. We buried my cousin. He died in a car accident on the interstate in his Jeep. When we got his body in the embalming room, Brother Mike, his muscles were huge. I'm telling you, one of his arms was about the size of my thigh. I'm talking about a short, stout little man. They said he could pump iron. They said, man, he ate right. They said that he done everything correctly. But one day on the interstate, God said, all right, death, you can have him. It don't matter how you feel. It don't matter what the facts are. It don't matter your faith. Death can still come and take you. Let me give you 3 things real quickly while Sister Amanda's coming to the piano. Let me say death don't care about your age either. And I've watched them bury the old, and I've watched them bury the middle age. Death has no respecter of your age. He don't care about it. He'd kill you right now if he could. Death has no respect for your affiliations. What do you mean, preacher? That's who you run with. That's who you are. You know, there was a man one day by the name of the Intimidator. And he was in a little car doing over 200 miles an hour. I said doing over 200 miles an hour. You cannot run death. And in Daytona, Florida, the Intimidator met death himself. It don't matter how big you are. It don't matter how small you are. When death finds you, it's over. It's still appointed unto men once to die, and after this, the judgment. Death does not care about your aspirations. Oh, preacher, I'm going to do good today. I'm going to do a little bit better. You better hope and pray that you're right with God today, in this hour, in this minute. For if death finds you, you'll have to stand before a thrice-holy God and give an account for the life that you lived. It don't matter who you are. It don't matter where you're at. Death will find you living under the shadow of death. Let me give you this. One funeral director said this, and I want to give this to you in closing. One funeral director said this. He said that the very shoes that you put on this morning, I may take them off tonight. What does that mean, preacher? What do you mean he may take mine off tonight? I've had to take the shoes off of many of people, of many young people in the funeral home, getting them ready for their own funeral. You realize the gas may already be in the hearse that carries you to the cemetery? The flowers that will overlay your casket may already be sitting in the florist. I don't believe, all right, preacher, death will find you. No matter who you are, what you've done. We're living under living under the shadow of death?
Carried away with your pride.
Are you actually living under the shadow of death?
Tell me, sinner, do you ever stop and think?
Listen to this chorus.
Are you afraid to die?
Are you afraid?